Megumi Fushiguro was one of the most prominent characters in Jujutsu Kaisen, and for many, he was one of the main characters. But as the series has gone on, he's kind of dropped off in prominence for a couple of reasons, and if you're caught up with the manga, you know exactly why. But I've been thinking a lot recently that I think he's been hiding a lot of power that we never got to see. So let's go ahead and talk about it. I mean, the first thing we have to talk about is his base technique, the 10 Shadows, gives a lot of power even though people don't talk about it. I mean, one of the important things to keep in mind is this is a technique that is supposed to belong to one of the big three families, keeping them at the top of the entire Jujutsu world. It is an incredibly strong technique even if we don't get to see it fully showcased. And as we watched its development through the manga and the anime, it certainly gave off that appearance. So what are some of the abilities that he can actually have? I think one of the biggest powers that we didn't get to see used very often was mixing Shikigami. This comes in one of two ways. One is if a Shikigami is destroyed, its traits and powers get passed on to the others. That's where Divine Dog Totality comes from. And while that is useful, it's not really the one that I'm thinking about. The one that I am thinking about is mixing the different Shikigami together by merging hand signs so that they become something new. This is similar to Bottomless Well, which is when you mix Nue with Gamma, you know, the frog and the toad, and the bird. That is an incredibly potent ability, and we didn't really get to see it utilized a lot beyond that one mixed technique, but there's probably a lot of abilities that could have come out of this because there are 10 different shadows, and even if you choose not to count Maharaga, 9 different combinations, and possibly more because it could be combinations of 3 or 4 as well, are incredibly abundant. And, you know, there's different ways to interpret how those abilities work. I mean, Nue is useful for travel, scouting, attack, and stunning because of the electricity. All that being told together, mixing Shikigami was definitely something that he could have gotten away with more, and probably would have been more beneficial throughout the series. And if you're interested in more deep dives like this, go ahead and check out my video on if Yuji was actually the weakest sorcerer. I think that it's also fair that you have to talk about some of the missing Shikigami, and I refer to them like this because despite the fact we did see 2 of them, they weren't his. I'm going to probably talk a little bit more at the end about Sukuna's role in all of this, but needless to say, I'm not counting his takeover mixing with the 10 Shadows technique other than a potential that Megumi could have had. But for the time being, the ones that Megumi was missing that we know of were the Charging Bull, Round Deer, Tiger Death, or Tiger Funeral, whatever that would have been, and then obviously Maharaga because it was never tamed. The bull is probably the simplest of all of them. It's a straightforward charger, but it's interesting that the longer it runs, the more damage it builds up. So, you know, if it continues just straightforward, if it hits something at 20 feet, it'll hit hard, 30 feet even harder. So it's a pretty prominent blunt weapon. And then you have Round Deer, which is interesting because one hand, it would be used for healing because it creates reverse cursed energy. So you can use it to heal yourself. You can also use it to disrupt enemy techniques because flooding your positive cursed energy into their regular cursed energy is going to disrupt everything. I also assume you could destroy pure cursed spirits like this way because Round Deer would just flood them with pure energy. And then obviously we know about Maharaga, it being the strongest. I've covered that in other videos. I'll probably cover it more in later ones, but it's probably the single strongest Shikigami in the entire series, and it's kind of gets overused and misused both in the later manga and even in the anime. They don't do it very good justice, so that probably deserves a full video. But needless to say, this thing made Sukuna scared, and if I say that phrase at all, that should really give you an idea. The last one is Tiger Funeral. And while I assume that is a tiger of some variety, we have no idea what it did, because the only time we've ever seen it, much like with Round Deer or Straight Bull, was from Sukuna, except we didn't see it. We found out he destroyed it and merged it with a couple of other Shikigami, which, like I said earlier, is not as useful as just mixing them outright because you don't have the utility. And we never see it again. We don't even know what its mainline ability was. So that is a little disappointing. I don't know if that was always the intent or Gege just decided he didn't run around out the full 10. But yeah, that was a little unfortunate. Now, had Megumi ever successfully grappled with and gotten control of Maharaga, he probably would have been considered a special grade, because Maharaga probably could beat anybody if applied correctly. I mean, using its base instincts, it did almost beat Sukuna. With Megumi, with other Shikigami, it might very well be the push over to be able to do that. Also, not to mention, since we do know, unfortunately, from Sukuna's control of it, that you can dictate how it adapts and what it adapts in particular, it's pretty flexible and very powerful. So that probably would have bumped Megumi right up into special grade. Of course, there's no real way for him to have tamed Maharaga, because nobody's ever had the technique has done it, so that's a bit of a, you know, 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other. It's kind of a pipe dream. It never would have happened. What he could have gotten complete control of, though, is his domain expansion. Now, while Chimera Shadow Garden was never finished, and if I'm going to place dollars to donuts, we will never see it completed in the series, it is interesting to think about what would have been. Megumi never did fully form the encapsulating prison for it, but to be honest, I don't think it needed it. It would have been more interesting had Megumi turned Chimera Shadow Garden into an open domain expansion similar to Malevolent Shrine or Bleeding Womb Perfusion, because I think it would have allowed him to just flood an entire area with replicated Shikigami. Now, keep in mind, the various Shikigami are the strength of this technique. Being able to flood an entire area with multiple of them would be outstandingly powerful. There is an indication that if, you know, per se, it was fully manifested, it could have done that, because some people think, whether it fully encapsulated or not, there's a creature that I can't quite pronounce the name of, but when I describe it, you'll understand it. It's like a giant skeleton in Japanese mythology, and they said to wander the roads at night and they would attack travelers. They were immortal and pretty much unbeatable because they were so high in spiritual power. A lot of people think this might have been the final manifestation of his domain expansion, or its can't miss attack. That would have been interesting, but we don't know for sure if that's what it was. Another consideration could have been that and the reason this comes from this is because there was a giant spinal cord forming the last time that Megumi ever cast Chimera Shadow Garden. It is also entirely possible that it could have been something more akin to, if you ever see Fate, some of those bioorganic abilities to make creatures could have been what that was more aiming for. And that might have actually been interesting, because if that had been completed, maybe that would have allowed him to create fully realized Shikigami, not just the kind of loose shadow versions that first appeared in the domain. And that probably was very powerful. I also think there's something to be said for, between Shadow Garden and his regular technique, continuing to reinterpret what it was, like making clones of himself, expanding into other Shikigami, creating whole extra pocket dimensions. There was a lot within his technique that could be used, and I think that, you know, had that gone even further, maybe he would have figured that out. So I think Megumi has been hiding a lot of power, and even though we never got to see it, it is still very fun to think about. Now, if you would like to learn more about something like this, check out my video on why I don't think Yuta and Yuji can actually pull off a win against Sukuna here. And with that, go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video, so I can keep bringing you more anime content.